if you are not tired. If you don't have anything to look at, okay.
Makes no sense anywhere else.
Okay, thanks.
As you can imagine, I'm retired now.
Yes.
Still hard at work.
People don't retire. Are you still working sort of
Medical history, anthropology, social history. I'm trying, I've been working for a long time in the book. I'm trying to finish it up.
on Tanzania?
Now on sort of a popular organization of medicine as it penetrates medical institutions in ambulatory centers. And it's gone on too long, so I'm trying to reach it. They're abandoned.
Either abandoned or the deadline comes.
Well, that's the same thing. You abandon them to the public.
But you never have enough. You never have enough. The
Right.
argument's always
Right,
going to be.
especially something like this, you know.
Good evening and thank you for being here. My name is Sheikh Babu and I'm an associate professor of history here at Penn. Some of you seems quite familiar. And it's my pleasure to introduce a friend of mine, a brother, and how do we call it, a co-alma mater or something like that. So he's from my alma mater, Michigan State University. Dr. Sarr is an associate professor. He's also the director of the Graduate Center in the Department of History at Ohio University. He is also an affiliate faculty of the African Studies program and a member of the Ohio University Press Board. In 2016, he was awarded the 2016-17 Janet Grassley Brown Faculty Teaching Award in the Humanities. And prior to joining the university, the Ohio University faculty, Dr. Sarr taught African and World History at the College of Charleston in South Carolina for 3 years. His research interests cover a wide range of topics, including agrarian change, land tenure in Islam in the Gambia region. Dr. Sarr has published several articles, book chapters, and a 2016 book entitled Islam, Power and Dependence in the Gambia River Basin, The Politics of Land Control, 1790-1940, with the University of Rochester Press. He is currently working on a book on the Tijaniya community in the Gambia, whose role in the growth and development of the Brotherhood in the Senegal was a major but not recognized in the scholars. Please join me in welcoming my friend and younger brother, Assan Sarr.
Thank you, Professor Babu, for that kind and generous introduction. I'm really pleased to be here. And thank you also to the center for the amazing hospitality. It's really good to be here. And thank you everybody for coming. This paper that I'm about to present is part of a larger book project that I'm working on the Tijaniya, and particularly a Muslim clerical family that settled in what was then part of a Mandinka kingdom called Nyumi during the pre-colonial period. It is really at its infancy, so I'm testing out some ideas that I hope we'll have a lot of discussion about to see if they make any sense. Okay, so the history of the Tijaniya in Nyumi, a small territory that used to be a Gambian Mandinka state in the pre-colonial times, dates back to as early as the 19th century. Today, the Tijaniya is the largest Sufi sect in the Gambia, a development that can be partly attributed to the role that Fulham Muslim clerics played in the region. One such clerical family is the Jallo family of Medina Charno, a tiny village in Openyomi, which served as a leading intellectual center for the development of Islam in the region. This is, I don't know if this is working. Medina Charno is situated just right around that area in the Openyomi region. Oops. I'm sorry.
Maybe you can try the keyboard.
Yeah.
Chandler, can you help somebody? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Medina Charno is also known as Medina Bafuloto. So it has different names. So this village, in describing this village in his 1932 provincial report, the commissioner of the North Bank province, who was British, listed Medina Charno as one of the few villages with quote schools at which advanced Arabic is taught. End of quote. In the height of its influence, students came from all over the region, even as far as the Region de Wakungona, or what is now part of Nyoro, Kolda, and even as far as Guinea-Bissau, the Firdu region. So we are talking about all this area. Student came from as far as this area. So how did the clerics of this village attract such following and acquire the reputation they enjoy? The answer that I'm proposing here is that the charisma, fame, and perceived spiritual power, which included the power to protect others, of these individual Muslim clerics attracted people to them. In his 1989 book, The Jahanka Muslim Cleric, historian Lamin Sane tells an intriguing story of the life and work of a Guinean Muslim cleric named Karamoko Ba, who lived sometime between 1730 to 1824. And the Guinea that I'm referring to is the Guinea-Conakry region. Labe here, this whole area, I will be coming back to this region often, as well as Futa Toro. These two Futas are really crucial in the story that I'm about to tell. According to the story that Sane narrates, a group of jinns had appeared to Karamoko Ba one day, forming an impressive spectacle in the presence of the Marabout and other Orthodox Muslim saints. The jinns appeared as Jews, Christians, and idol worshippers, namely meaning Muslims, non-Muslims. This meeting was a sort of spiritual company between the Muslim religious personalities that were present in this meeting and the jinns, and it all occurred supposedly in the invisible realm. Karamoko Ba's followers interpreted this story as one that elevated his spiritual and religious stature as a Marabout. The Marabout was in the company of saints and supernatural forces such as jinns. Being in the company of jinns, saints, and angels speaks to one's nearness to God. The supernatural, which has long been the domain of anthropologists, guided many Muslim understanding of their world and their social success and misfortune, as well as their past. For many Muslims, the unseen supernatural world constitutes an integral element of the social fabric informing every aspect of social and political life. The causes of illness, both physical and metaphysical, are commonly sought among the jinns and other multidimensional beings. Similarly, solutions to the problems of everyday life, social anxieties, insecurity, desire for a better livelihood, are often sought by invoking the power of these invisible forces or people that interacted with them. spiritual knowledge or remedies are pursued by a talisman or marabouts, saints, shrines, and possession calls. Spiritual knowledge demonstrated through one's mastery over both the natural and the supernatural worlds serve as a means to religious power. In fact, Islamic cosmology recognizes the idea of the two worlds, this one and the next. In addition to humans, there exist rival elemental beings who inhabit their own destinations. Belief in spirits, therefore, particularly jinns, were easily fit into both a pre-Islamic and Islamic ontology, and were in different time periods believed to be feared, defeated, or domesticated. For people living along the banks of the Gambia River, one of the most important of these spirits were the Kondorong. The Kondorongs were human-like jinns that were very short and malevolent, and they lived in the forest. It is a mythical bearded dwarf with feet back to front that sometimes wrestle with a person it meets and throws them to the ground, or it may play tricks on the person. People believe the Kondorongs would typically appear to a lone individual in either the bush or their farm. In some cases, in the case that the Kondorong throws the person to the ground during the wrestling, the latter would either die or get paralyzed. Another frightening spirit is the Ninkenanka. In 1906, the North Bank Commissioner Lloyd Price described the fear that the natives had about the Ninkenanka. He wrote, "A well-known Mandinka myth is the Ninkenanko, which is supposed to resemble a gigantic crowned serpent which resides in the thickest bush or the swamps. If a native sees the body of this creature, he believes he will be afflicted with dangerous sickness, but if he sees the eyes or the crown, it means instantaneous death. No native will go anywhere near where one of these creatures is supposed to be." And this Ninkenanko is basically, in Wolof, is the dragon. Which is a very big, mysterious snake. In her 1952 book, Lady Soughton, who was then the wife of the Governor General of the Gambia, described this fear that people had for the Ninkenanko. And she said, "The people were dogged by fear of devils, and chief among these is the Ninkenanka. If seen by a man, is a sign of approaching death." For example, David Gamble, who is an anthropologist that worked in the Gambia, gathered a story of how 6 Jola women in a town called Bakau, which was during the colonial period called St. Mary's. These 6 women died because they saw a Ninkenanka. The jinn spirit occupied the non-human world as well. But that non-human world was really next to the human world too. So it's not that far away. Which many Senegambians believe was a dangerous space for humans. Jinns were kafirs first, that is non-Muslims. But once they became Muslim, they presented no danger to the human population. In fact, the Muslim jinn was kind, friendly, and protective of humans. The kafir jinn, on the other hand, was vengeful and deceitful. Time after time, settlements mentioned by early European writers that seem to have been of some importance in their day have vanished completely. David Gamble again attributes this constant waxing and waning and breaking up of these villages to such beliefs. Residents of the Mandinka village of Saba in Badibo, which the Wolof call Rip, part of the Salum area, tell stories of a spirit jinn that live in the swamps near the village. This jinn played the drum and it also loved dancing. To appease it, residents of the village had regular ritual dances. If they failed to do so, people could die. Describing the fear that people had of these spirits in 1907, the Commissioner Price again noted, quote, the Mandinkas, he said, are firm believers in jinni, meaning jinns. Every village is supposed to have two of these, a bad spirit and a good spirit. In some cases, they say the village spirit or jinni are male and female. Sometimes the male is good and the female bad. It was considered extremely dangerous to settle in a place already inhabited by these female jinns. Jinns had their own favorite times of the day, the time before dawn and dusk, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the hottest part of the day, or at midnight. These were the most dangerous hours when jinns were most likely to be out and about, and it was dangerous for ordinary people to be out. Why are all these stories important in helping clerics persuade their followers to accept their religious order? Senegambian historiography gives only a vague reference to the important position the jinn spirit occupied in West African Islamic cosmology or the people that interacted with them, even though there are traces of these forces in the archives and plenty in the oral sources. Historians probably perceive references to the supernatural realm as myth and therefore not accurate sources of information. The people of Fouta Toro, this Fouta, in the upper Senegal River, they claim that Umar Tal, one of the 19th century Muslim reformers from the region, tamed the jinns and sorcerers of those places he attacked, and during one of his wars he enlisted a jinn spirit to fight for him. While historians of the Umerian Jihad have discussed the significance of miracle stories such as these, they did not consider the larger symbolic meaning of the claim that jinn warriors joined the Umerian Jihad, and perhaps what it adds to our understanding of the meaning of jihad and conversion for the people of this region. As anthropologist Bill Darman demonstrates, in Fouta Jalon, Fulham Muslims believe that there were Muslim jinns and Kafir jinns, or the heathens, but did not detail narratives of how the so-called Muslim jinns came to join Islam. Or similarly, Lamin Sane's discussion of the jinns that were Jews or Christians, but how did they become Jews or Christians to begin with. In the rest of the talk, I will try to tackle these questions and why I think we need to pay attention to them. I'll do so by focusing on the period when Medina Cherno, this village, let me go back, sorry. This village was founded. A period that coincided with the era when Muslim clerics played a crucial role in transforming Islam as a dominant faith and practice in the region. I'll focus on the Toranka cleric, Cherno Muhammadu Baba Jallo, who was born around 1890 and he died around 1996, and who carried on the work of his father in this area. His father settled in this area sometime around the second half of the 19th century. He was the one that founded this town, and he was the one whose father, that is Cherno Jallo, was said to have received the Tariqa Tijaniya from Alhaji Umar Tal at Saint Louis in Senegal, and then decided to take it to the Gambia River region. In fact, followers of this clerical family claim that Sheikh Abdullah Nias of Medina Kaula received the Tariqa order from Cherno Jallo. That is the great grandfather of this Sheikh that I'm about to focus on. Now, it's very, very interesting that in the Gambia, members of this clerical family are regarded as Toranka. In Mandinka, that means people from Futa Toro. Just the Mandinkanized version of Torodo or Torode. But in reality, Cherno Ibrahim Jallo, the great-grandfather of this sheikh, hailed from this region. And although the family had very strong ties to Futa Toro, yet that's their original homeland. Cherno Baba came from an important religious family. His great-grandfather, Cherno Ibrahim Jallo, is from Labe in Futa Jallo. But his family had strong connections to Futa Toro. And this is why Nyominkas, that is people from Nyomi, regarded them as Torankas. Cherno Baba succeeded his father, Cherno Umar, as leader of the religious community in 1940, during a time when the world was at war. This was also a difficult time for his community because he inherited a village from his father that had no roads, no major roads linking it to the outside world. And also villagers needed to clear farmlands, which meant intrusion into lands previously occupied by evil forces. Cherno Baba Jallo devoted much of his life to scholarship promoting Islam and farming. Around 1920, when he founded his own Dara, I have a photograph of, I'll show you later. Dara, which is the Quranic school, and was about 30 years old at the time, he began to expand his following by treating mental illness, conquering or converting spirits into Islam, and taking care of the poor. He demonstrated the qualities of waliyu, that is saint or friend of Allah, and performed numerous karamas or miracles, wrote many religious texts, and concentrated on teaching. His followers viewed him as a transformational figure and a scholar. Like one of his talibes claimed, Cherno Baba communicated his message to those with Gelawar ears, the Gelawar being the non-Muslim warrior class that controlled this Wall of Syria region during the 19th century. As cornerstones of his life, he always preached hard work and piety. From the 1670s until about the 1880s, Senegambia was the site of a series of religious wars. In the Gambia, this jihad continued until about 1902, when the ringleader of the Soninke Marabo War, as these holy wars were called in the Gambia, was defeated. However, these jihads did not succeed in eliminating the Soninke class across the country. And when the Mandinka used the term Soninke, they're really not referring to the ethnic group called the Sarahule or the Soninke. They are referring to, again, the warrior class, the Mandinka Mansaya, that controlled the Gambia river states during the 18th and the 19th century. And by the way, the Gelawar were more or less a resemblance of this Soninke class. So, for instance, as late as 1927, Ilyasa, a village in the Rip, Badibu, was described as a Soninke stronghold. That is, non-Muslims were living in the area. So, as late as the early 20th century, in other words, there were non-Muslims living among the population in the lower Gambia river basin. That's the point. These holy wars has been examined extensively by historians, and their writings have shed much light on the political significance of religious movements as well as the careers of key Muslim leaders from the region. The scholarship is also beginning to consider the variety of meanings attached to the notion of holy war or jihad. This growing literature reveals that jihad involved, among other things, using education or strategies to discipline the soul as a tool to instill Islamic values and seal people against the corrupting effects of negative influences. However, jihad, whether peaceful or militant, may not be waged only against humans. Jihad also was waged against bad spirits such as jinns. This kind of jihad was a form of spiritual confrontation against spirits that were non-Muslims. In other words, bad. Warfare or conquest was not just a military reality. Conflict can also occur in the spiritual domain or the spiritual spaces. Cherno Baba once said, "If the spirits refuse to convert, I will fight with them." He waged his jihad against jinns and other spirits by conducting halwa, which is the spiritual retreat. Every time he was ready to attack a place that was known to be occupied by these jinns, he would then retreat for 7 days in prayer, and then assign prayers also to his disciples before he then forces these jinns out of this area. Cherno-Baba was also said to have deployed many miracles over the course of his life. Like in many African Muslim societies, his followers tell stories of how he developed the ability to communicate with saints. Saints, some of them who were long gone, who had died a long time ago. Or even seeing Prophet Muhammad in his dreams, and Prophet Muhammad communicating to him. He also was claimed to, it's also claimed that Angel Jibril also appeared to him, and that he traveled to Mecca and Medina while asleep. His followers believed that he either drove Kafir jinns from the Jumankari, Bangali, and Nambu forests, or converted the rest of them into Islam. And by the way, this is the area that just about 50 years before this story, before these incidents supposedly happened, another colonial commissioner, Emilius Hopkinson, had described as that part of Nyomi, which ran extended for several miles, that the natives would never venture to go there or settle in these areas. And in my 2016 book on Islam, Power and Dependency, I described how marabouts who appeared, Muslim clerics who appeared in this area during this period, basically were responsible for opening up this land, and therefore settlements, new settlements, got established all across this region, and therefore people started cutting down the trees and planting crops, and this coincided with the expansion of groundnut production or cash crop production in the area. But that's a side note here. So he's also said to have driven a Ninkinanka, a dragon, from the swamps nearby. After this happened, he established a big orchard with mangoes, oranges, pineapples, coconuts, grapefruits, and bananas, seedlings that he got from one of his followers or talibans from Freetown, Sierra Leone. And by the way, there are cool stories of how this person traveled with a steamer that the British had there that was operating between the Gambia and Sierra Leone. By the way, those two colonies were once administered as one British territory. So the Apapa used to operate between Freetown and the Gambia. Cherno Baba's followers also claimed that the Marabu had the power to speak to jinns. When one of his granddaughters was sick because the jinns wanted to kill her, Cherno Baba summoned them to a meeting and warned them to not harm her. And as a result, she was healed. Stories of his travel, also narrated by Al-Hadi Musa and one of his disciples, claim that during one of their trips to the Firdu country, up in the Kolda region, the Cherno asked him to stop the truck when they entered the Jalakumbe forest and asked for his prayer mat. He then prayed. After he completed his prayers, the jinn asked him to spend time with them in the Jalakumbe forest. Some of the jinns wanted to be converted to Islam, they claim. Taming the jinns and protecting people against them gave Muslim leaders like Cherno Baba Jallo a kind of authority, a kind of religious authority that attracted people to them. Muhammad Maruf and his work on jinn eviction in Morocco demonstrates that in Morocco, as in Fouta Djallon and in the Gambia region, jinns are believed to have the capacity to ruin a person's life by being haunted by them. In order for the individual to regain self-control, the jinn must be evicted. But who did this work? It must be the clerics themselves. Thus, he concludes, ritual and myth represent an extremely effective form of ideological control. Healing. As I stated earlier, Nyome's residents believe in the ability of spirits to harm those that trespass on their land. In fact, for many Gambians, the cause of illness is not biological but spiritual. People got sick because of evil spells or attacks by invisible forces. In 1925, a terrible outbreak of relapsing fever occurred at Nokunda in the North Bank province, about 70 kilometers from Medina Cherno. The epidemic rapidly swept off half the population of the village, killing about 700 people. The people believed that the pandemic fell on them because certain lands that had never before been cultivated for fear of disturbing the devil, according to the commissioner's report, were tilled during the 1924 famine season. That is a year before the outbreak, the epidemic broke out. As such, the village was removed to an entirely new site, presumably with the help of someone like Cherno Baba Jallo. Mental illness was also believed to have been caused by evil spirits. Muslim clerics were considered to possess magical and mystical powers to intervene on behalf of the sick. For instance, in Fouta Djallon, only specialists called the Karamoko, we are going back to Karamoko the Karamoko, the religious leader whose powers were thought to stem from Islam, were the people who could cure these kinds of illness. According to Gaspard Mollien, a French traveler who visited the Gambia region in 1820, he described the people this way. The Mohammedan priests communicate with the deity and interpret his will, which they turn to the account of the object which they have in view. They have so artfully contrived to excite in the minds of the Negroes a blind confidence in the papers which they call Grigri, which is the amulet that these Muslim clerics made. A story published in a 1999 magazine recounting how Cherno Baba Jallo treated a patient named Aliu Gaulo with mental illness. Aliu Gawlo was from the village of Molet in the Lower Nyomi section of the area, closer to the Senegal, to the coastal, to the border, the coastal area near the border with Senegal. When his illness worsened, his relatives decided to take him to Medina Charno to seek help from the Marabu. But because Aliu's mental health condition involved aggressiveness and temptation to be violent, the relatives had his hands and legs tightened with ropes. Once they arrived at Charno Baba's house, the Marabu ordered the family to untie him. Gawlo's relatives hesitated, knowing how violent he could turn from one second to the other, but Charno Baba repeated his request to untie him. Gawlo's family complied. Aliu looked dazed and confused. When Charno Baba asked him, Aliu, what's the matter? He replied, nothing. Aliu sounded very normal. Suddenly, the confusion ceased and he was well. Charno Baba asked Aliu's relatives to take him to a room and give him water to wash himself off, food to eat, and clean clothes to wear. 2 weeks later, when Aliu's relatives were ready to return to Mbolet, his village, Aliu refused to go with them, stating, I will not leave my Marabu, I will not leave Charno Baba Jallo. The magazine article claims that Charno Baba cured many like Aliu Gawlo, even without touching them. To conclude, the miracles described in this talk speaks to the world that Marabus created for themselves in Senegambian society. Their spiritual powers were believed to be superior to other members of the community, and this made them natural guardians of society, so to speak. These powers increased their social legitimacy as they used their powers to convert, quote, spirit lands into ideal human habitation or farmlands, and or to cure others. Jihad, or claims of fighting jihad against the jinns and or converting jinns into Islam were not just suggest that these two processes or activities, jihad and conversion, were not just directed to human beings, but also jinns. For the lower Gambians, the Muslim community, as well as the non-Muslim community, also included supernatural beings that could live around them, but could not be seen by ordinary people. Lastly, the ability to execute miracles was a sign of holiness. Miracles also serve as an attestation to a cleric's divine election and power, which were important articles of faith for the Talibes or followers of these sects. As historian David Robinson states, without this initial belief, a Taliban would not have accepted his cleric's message. So I just want to show you. I talked about Cherno Ibrahim Jallo, who was born sometime around 1803, who came from Futa Jalon, and he was the one who gave birth to Cherno Jallo, who supposedly received the Tariqa Tijaniya from Al-Haji Umar Tal in Saint Louis, and he was the one who then gave it to Al-Haji Abdullah Nias, and then his own son, Cherno Umar Jallo, who was the one that made it to the Gambia. So Cherno Umar Jallo was the father of all these men that you see here. This was Al-Haji Cherno Baba Jallo. This is Al-Haji Mas Jallo. These were his younger brothers. All of them, and this is the mosque that before Al-Haji Baba died in the 1990s, he built this mosque back in the 70s. But this mosque is in Medina Channel. Oop. And that's a photo of him that I also got from the family. So, and this is one of the daras in the village. Young boys studying the Quran at night around the fire, and there are dozens of daras like this in the village. So I take you back to what the commissioner said in his 1932 report, that this is a place where advanced, quote and unquote, advanced Arabic was taught, and you had students, coming from as far as, there is one report in which the number of students that were estimated to be there was at least over 1,500 students, and they're coming from the Firdu country. People in this village believe that, in Willingara, Kolda area up to Sobulde, this is the family that actually paved that place, made it Muslim in a way, because those areas were, and part of Casamas too, that were hardly touched by Islam in the early 19th century. So they make that place too. And then this is a better image of the mosque itself. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I take questions.
Thank you so much. I think I'm going to let you fill your questions.
Yes.
So I'm just going to sit there and then.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. Any questions, please? Yes.
So I have a question that maybe is still settling in my head, so I apologize if this is not very articulate. But it seemed to me that many of the manifestations of the jinn that you had mentioned at this time were in forms of illness or sickness, the ways that they took up residence in persons' bodies and then had to be expelled, or there was an epidemic in a certain place. And so I guess there's kind of two parts to this question. Maybe one, is illness kind of the exclusive way that a place manifests its kind of jinn problem, or if there are others, like let's say you mentioned famines or things like this. And then the second question is more about the domain of medicine, and how, if there is at this time like a kind of separate domain of medicine, or is that really subsumed into the religious domain at this time, or how do those kind of sit together?
Yeah, no, thank you. Those are terrific questions. Yes, most of the stories that they're telling about jinns and what they could do to people, and here I should say, just the kafir jinns, the bad ones. The good ones are cool. They help people. They protect people. They don't, and those were the Muslims. So the kafir jinns, all they unleashed onto the human population was misery, illnesses, or death. That's the kind of narrative that they are telling. And perhaps for me, what that entails is that people were gravitating towards these clerics for really practical reasons, that they also wanted to be healed, they wanted to be protected, and many of the jinns in the area appeared as snakes, very big snakes, or really very deceptive animals like the antelopes that can lure you as a hunter or a farmer who is trying to go after the deer or the antelope, and then get into a place where you basically get disoriented, so you can't even find your way back to where you came from. So those were the kinds of and when I should say that when you go back eventually to your home, you're not going to be you're not going to be safe from it. You might fall sick and die unless you are rescued by someone like this miracle. That's how they explain these kinds of miracle stories. Now about healing, that's really interesting, because one of the things that Cherno Baba does later, and in fact, as soon as his father died in 1940 and he took over as the leader of the community, he was still active before his father died. But once his father died and he became the leader of the community, he organized his community to build a dispensary, the first dispensary in this region. And the colonial officials were very skeptical, in fact dismissive of the whole project, that this is never going to go anywhere. And they built the dispensary, and then he then sent people to the district colonial office and said, we really need a dispenser in this place. So the first dispensary in this part of the Gambia region was built by him and his followers. And you just these roofs that you see here, this is also the school. So he was not really that anti competition, if you like, from the secular institutions that that could also provide some of these services. But for his followers, I think the most potent message was this message about these genes and the treatment or the protection that a miracle like this could also offer. And for me, this is really crucial, because this, you have to go back to the fundamental ethnographic reality of this area. People were mostly farmers, very rural, very agrarian. So what's more important than the land on which they live and how they interact with this land every day? And that's where I think these stories could help us understand how that really shifts over time. Like over the course of the mid-19th century, early 20th century, almost all these spirit lands disappear because they've been disarmed of these evil spirits. So that's the story that I tell, generally speaking. Yeah.
Just a brief follow-up.
Yeah.
I can understand the lack of concern about competing with Western biological medicine.
Mm-hmm.
I can understand that, because the idea is there is different type of diseases. There is kind of, the origins are different, the cure are different. Gene disease are non-Western disease.
Yeah.
That actually Sheikh and Saint and Muslims can address. But then you have biological disease that are real Western disease that the dispensary may actually. I don't know if the concept here was.
Yes. In fact, you know very well that the Wolof will say "february nit ku ñuul," February tubaab. So the Western ailments and the African or black ailments, I mean, they're very different. And when they talk about how do you remedy these things, for each of these different ailments, you have to go somewhere else. Like, so, yes, maybe that speaks to. Thank you very much for. Yes.
Thanks for the wonderful talk. And I want to talk about the same question of healing traditions. It sounds like in the area there are no indigenous healers. It sounds like we have only Muslims.
Yeah.
And then we have biomedicine. But
Yeah.
what happened to indigenous healers? That is I see them, they are absent here.
Yes, that is a very that is a fantastic question. In fact, one of the things that I talk about in the book 2016 book is the way in which the important role that so-called traditional healers and hunters and smiths, blacksmiths, who had so much supernatural powers in the Mandinka worldview, began to be associated with animism, and therefore they took a second place in the overall narrative. So this is more or less a very mid-19th century, early 20th century Islamic perspective in the area. But still, people in Mandinka, there is what they call mankano. The mankano is these objects you can get from powerful medicine men or women, and then place it on your land, bury it inside on your land. That is in case of land disputes. And anyone who then intrudes into that land, let's say you have a problem with somebody else, your neighbor, and you're quarreling over the ownership of a land, you could go to Guinea-Bissau or to the Sarr region of Sin, where you can get the more authentic, powerful mancanos and bury it there. And that's a kind of warfare, that's a kind of battle that you are fighting, but you are not fighting it in the open. And the belief is that those are Jahiliya practices. They are non-Muslim, and it's bad to be an idol worshipper as a Muslim, so it's not Islamized in a way. But there are people who say, well, wait a minute, can I just stop my being Muslim for a minute and teach this person a lesson and get this stuff and plant it there and deal with them and then go back to Islam. I have found some cool stories about that too. But yes, yes.
I have two brief questions.
Yeah.
One is, what role did shrines and cults play in this very complex situation? And the other, did the two types of spirits that you mentioned, was there any sort of spatial sort of principles connected with them, so that the sort of dominance of the Islamic jinns would lead to a spatial reorganization of the landscape in at least a cultural way as far as the population is concerned?
Yeah, no, very, very, very good, good questions. Let me start with the spatial one, the space question. Yes, I said in my book that this belief in spirits or jinns more broadly, or more specifically, they define the landscape all along the Gambia River region. I mean, if you look at the Gambia River region prior to this period, most of the big villages tended to be concentrated in some places and with extensive space unoccupied, supposedly unoccupied lands, dotting across the region. And people have, or scholars have in the past used this to argue that land ownership was really not important to the Africans prior to the 20th century, when land became commoditized and connected to the market economies and individualized. But what I argue in that book is that no, I think there was another element that you mix. That the idea that those lands were unoccupied is not really true, because those lands were occupied but by different forces. They were not for humans. And therefore, the idea of land abundance or the availability of land is something that we need to scrutinize, because you cannot take the African worldview out of the calculus that really shaped the way in which farmers or agriculturalists interacted with their space. But as soon as you had an influx of these marabouts all coming from Futa Toro and the Futa Jalon, and they came with these stories of having these kinds of extraordinary power to push these spirit lands to near extinction. All of a sudden, the forest disappeared. So you do not have really any vegetation of any substance in the area, and it's coinciding again with the expansion of cash crop economy, and it's really crucial for the British colonial government, who were also busy competing with the French, who were based in Senegal. So yes, it completely reorganizes the ecological and geographical landscape of the area. I mean, these 15 ideas really change everything. Sorry, I seem to forget your first question.
About the shrines. And
the shrines and the cults. Yes. No, they I conducted a lot of interviews for this, and since I was really interested in the land questions, I traveled to many villages across the Gambia River region, interviewing people about this. But when it comes to the Islamic aspects, they want to downplay the importance of cults and possession. But they acknowledge it. They say, okay, well, it's only people who are not disciplined to follow the Islamic rules and ideas are the ones who are seeking these kinds of remedies. But they are not encouraged. But the idea is that it's there.
But not discussed.
Yes, not discussed. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, two questions. One in relation to the question that Sheikh asked before about two different kinds of illnesses. And my question about that is, if I say, as a complete outsider, were to look at different kinds of diseases, could I say this disease is a disease to be treated this way, and this disease is in the secular way, and this disease is in the biomedical way, and this disease to be treated in the Muslim way, or is it that you try treating diseases, and then you try one way of treating diseases, and then you try another way of treating diseases, and according to how it responds, you decide which one it really was all the while.
Yes.
So that's one question, and then the other is a comment, which is that in relation to shrines in Central Africa, where Islam is not in Malawi in this case in particular, where Islam is only recently an issue. One of the original people who studied the shrines spoke about it as a ritually directed ecosystem. That is, that there were specifically ecological reasons, and they would even to the point where the authorities who had relations with these shrines could say, this stream is the number of fish in this stream is going down, and therefore no one should fish in this stream for a certain period. And so it was done in the language of the spirits, but at the same time there were observations of nature that were a part of it. So that's just a comment.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. By the way, I mean, I have so many stories of, you know, certain fruits, people being discouraged from harvesting certain fruits in the forest because they could be surprised with lasses from the genes that own the trees, or you know, so people are not supposed to go there and harvest those fruits, particularly at certain times. Again, really pointing to this important point about the ecological control or the ecological reasons for these kinds of beliefs. Although I have argued in the book that maybe people didn't have these beliefs simply as a conscious effort to conserve their local environment in some ways, but at least for the Gambia River region. But clearly it helped. And once those beliefs weaken, it just paved the way to for the destruction of those kinds of trees that people believe that these genes or these spirits once inhabited. The point about the remedies, how do people diagnose or decide which of the illnesses should be treated in the secular or Western biomedical system, or the marabouts. People tend to send their loved ones to marabouts and do what we call listikhar, look into their own circumstances. What's happening to me? You're about to go for a job interview, or you're about to sit an exam. You say, well, let me go consult a marabout, more or less a fortune teller, to tell me what's going to happen to me when I take this exam, whether I'm going to pass or not. And then the marabout does his listikhar in the morning, calls you and tells you the outcome. So in such situations, if he says, well, I don't think this is a disease you should take to the hospitals, you should look for a marabout, then there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's say you go to the marabout, and then you aren't better.
Yeah.
And you say, I went to the marabout, I'm still not better, so maybe I'll go to the hospital. And then if you then get cured in the hospital, you say retrospectively, this really was a hospital disease. Maybe the marabout didn't quite understand.
Yes, indeed. And sometimes you could go from one marabout, it doesn't work, then you go to another marabout. Because it's also, they say, you know, each person and their own marabout, and you could also switch marabouts depending on the successful
And if they
outcome.
can't help you, you say, you know, the gin was just too strong.
Yeah.
The marabouts didn't have the means.
Or you did not follow the prescriptions given by the marabout themselves.
But I think I think that quintessentially some diseases that are marabout disease. I think misfortune is something you don't seek help from biological medicine. Misfortune.
Right.
I think some mental illnesses you don't go to them anywhere else. People will tell you this is where you need a traditional healer or a marabout. These are quintessentially
February rap.
Yes.
These are quintessentially really kind of traditional.
But some straddle, like infertility. Infertility would be
In between. You know.
In between.
I was gonna say that I wonder if are these categories in fact so distinct that there is this kind of classification of this is for marabout and this is for. I mean, it seems to me that perhaps there's probably just as there might be an eclecticism between. I can see marabout A and then seeing marabout B. Perhaps also seeing a marabout might help the efficacy of certain kind of medicine.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there seems to be some blurring of the lines, but in the conceptualization, people make it very clear that these are these are Marabu things that Marabus can handle versus things that the hospitals can handle. But
Or I took the medicine and it wouldn't have worked if I hadn't also gone to the marathon.
if I yes yes so yes sorry I'll have you and then yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So my question is
Yeah.
about the identity of the genes,
Okay.
and because like you refer to them like there are some Muslims, some Kafir, and then within the cosmology you also mentioned these beings like the snake and so on, and you know that like the jinn and whether they are Muslims or non-Muslims or so on is also in the Quran.
Mhm.
So how like the argument is being made like what like in this system here that what we are saying to you is not like a hearsay. This is like a strong thing coming from our religion, and so you have to believe in these things. You say, and so also following that is the way in which like these kinds of illness are just being treated, like the devices like which were used, whether the Quran also is being used in this discussions.
Yeah. No, thank you very much for that. Yes, the story that they keep telling is that when God made people, also made genes first, and that genes are part of the universe. That so it's very strong. It's a belief that people have that genes are not just a myth out there, and that's why I think it's important to pay attention to the way in which people explain how they interact with their land and their space in general, because I think for too long historians haven't really paid much attention to this. Anthropologists, I think, did an awful lot of work in this area, but the historical literature hasn't really caught up with that idea. And if you look at the way they narrate these stories about identity or the personalities of these genes. So I discussed how genes were first non-Muslims or Kafirs, and then later became Muslim, depending, and some refused to convert and were driven out. But you also had the male and the female. And I think what is intriguing is why is the female gene perceived as the most vindictive gene as opposed to the male gene. That's really interesting for me. But also, you had some personalities who they say, and these are people who either married a female gene, has wives that are people, and then a female gene that basically gives him more power, or some woman that disappeared during her childhood and was with a gene for 15, 20 years, and then all of a sudden reappeared in the community, and therefore, what status does she now have in the community as an individual? Trust me, you see a lot of people going to her for again these kinds of solicited intervention to solve some of their problems. I mean, I've in this project, I have one woman that actually I talk about how she became really very, very powerful in this area as a result of that story that she was once stolen by Jinn and raised by Jinn for a couple of years and given that kind of special knowledge, and then she went back to the community.
Like
Never
a mammy
married.
water. She's like a mammy water then.
Oh,
Like a mammy water.
yeah, sort of, but she's right there in the.
But once somebody's been possessed, they go back to the
They go back to the community. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So the identity is really, I think, very, very interesting. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say earlier to your question, I've heard many stories of people who try and get Western medicine and they can't be provided with a diagnosis, so then they go to Muhammadu, and like, that'll be their last resort. Because miracles can be very expensive.
Yeah, that's true. Too. People, yes, yes.
Yeah, you talk a lot about the genes, but the ancestors are not in the picture here, because in many societies, the ancestors are the ones who are also supposed to protect the community
Yeah.
against some illness and so on and so on. But in this story, or in this community, the ancestors have disappeared.
Yes,
I mean,
because, because it's a 19th century community, so there isn't a very long genealogical. If the ancestors are going to be important, and by the way, these are itinerant scholars who really kept moving from place to place. Look at Futa Jalon to Futa Toro and to Firdu. I mean, that's a lot of space, a lot of ground to cover, number one. Number two, the ancestors, if we have to go back to the population that live around this area, they are Soninke, they are non-Muslims. You cannot now talk about their perceived powers, because that represents drinking alcohol, mounting on the horseback with your gun and shooting people and seizing harvest from farmers. So the notion of Chedoya or Soninkeya, it's actually in the background here in people's minds. So it's not something to be celebrated in a way. So here you see a very this is how I characterize Gambian oral traditions. That you have these Gambian Mandinka traditions that talk about the expansion of the Manding Empire and the founding of the Kabul state and almost all these principalities that were part of Kabul, be it Nyomi, Jokadu, Badibu, and so on and so forth. And that's the tradition that talks about warriors, aristocrats, and state builders. But then there is a break. Nothing in between, except you have the 19th century Muslim reformers and the stories of Islam. And that's how they characterize these histories. So anything, if Muslims are talking about the aristocratic period, that's not necessarily a glorified period in history. So that's how I read the oral traditions. Yes.
Well, yeah, I think, but I want you to comment on the kind of religious epistemology that is going on here, and which allowed not only honor but legitimize these ideas about spirits and their interaction with people. You're talking here about Tijaniya. This is the Sufi community. What it is in the religious epistemology that create an ideological environment that made these ideas acceptable and being part of Islam?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think that beyond the accepting the basic principles of the Tijaniya order, that is taking the wird, which is the tariqa from the sheikh, and then having to abide by that principle that you accept to be part of, and cannot therefore switch to another to another order. And then the wajifa, doing the every, like, is it around Takusan dawn,
Right.
you know, where people meet in the mosque and recite certain songs or prayers, and so on and so forth, and having the sheikh, who is basically your spiritual guide. Everything else was really open in the air. And I think for marabouts like Cherno Omar Diallo and his sons, they understood that perhaps, and this is just a guess for now, that in this Mandinka Soninke region, we have to have a pedagogy to relate with people in a language that they can understand. And the miracles, the stories of these kinds of miracles become really central. So yes, they do the ziyaras and the gamos and try to be as Tijaniya as they can be. But at the same time, these kinds of narratives become really visible everywhere in the kinds of stories that people tell. I don't know if that.
Yeah, I was actually thinking of
Yeah.
the kind of Sufi concept of unveiling. Unveiling.
Unveiling, yeah.
The idea of the connection with the world of the unseen,
Mm-hmm.
which is part of religious epistemology, that you kind of learn from the book, but also you learn from this connection with God.
Mm-hmm.
When you are successful in befriending him, and by befriending him, then he can unveil the unseen for you.
Yeah.
So that this kind of connection with the world of the unseen make it much easier for people to connect to jinn and spirits than, let's say, somebody who's a Salafist or somebody who will have a textual reading of Islam, which doesn't allow other knowledge but the discursive kind of knowledge.
That's fantastic. That is something definitely. I mean, and that's why I said, like, these miracles. Somebody who can deploy these miracles was seen as an individual who was closer to God, and therefore, I mean, he does not have these powers simply because of his own attributes, but because of God's intervention. Although it can be passed down from the sheikh to the next person who inherits the. So thank you. That's a very good point that I will definitely try to develop.
We have time for just one more question.
No more questions?
Well,
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
That was so